I'm Danielle Knapp, the McCosh Associate Curator at the Jordan Schnitzer Museum of Art. This special presentation of my lecture, David McCosh at Home and Abroad, was planned in conjunction with two exhibitions currently on view at the JSMA, David McCosh's Eugene, on view in the Schnitzer Gallery through January 25th, and McCosh in Europe in the McKinnon Gallery through February 1st. Both of these exhibitions were planned in conjunction with the 100th anniversary of the School of Architecture and Allied Arts. In addition to these shows, the museum currently has on view work by AAA's first MFA in printmaking, Gordon Gilkey, and in a few months we'll put on view works from the estate of former professor and sculptor Jan Zach. I should mention that many of the images included in this presentation are images, both archival photographs and works of art that are part of the David and Anne McCosh Memorial Collection and Archive housed at the JSMA. So we can get started. To start with, here is a portrait of McCosh later in his life in his home studio in Eugene, where many of his works were created or worked on after being started outdoors on site. Throughout McCosh's life, as his visual study of the surrounding world guided him as a painter, he sought to achieve his best possible work through a pursuit of new inspiration, balanced with constant, careful re-examining of the familiar. If we are to examine him as an artist, or as he preferred, the more direct and accurate designation of painter, we must do so in consideration of what informed and shaped his painting. The greatest leaps in his growth and development as a draftsman and painter did not always occur within the walls of the art department classrooms in Lawrence Hall on campus. This vital aspect of his painting career occurred, or at least started, in places where he was engaged with what he called fresh inspiration. Travel was key. In total, the time spent outside the United States was less than 4 years, a blink of an eye within the long lifespan of a man who passed away at age 78. But the reach of these years was long. On view upstairs in the Schnitzer Gallery right now are some of the results of that visual relationship, and with the few exceptions of works depicting scenes near Horse Creek, about 60 miles east of campus, almost every other scene depicted in paint in that gallery space is from within just a few miles, in some cases less than 2 miles from where the museum stands. McCosh's reputation and very identity as an artist is tied to a place, here, Eugene, at the University of Oregon, where he taught for nearly 40 years. McCosh arrived in 1934 following a few years of productive but not always profitable work as an instructor and studio assistant in Chicago and New York. His early work reflected the traditional curriculum of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he received a BFA and MFA, and the prevalent Midwest regionalism of Chicago, though we know that McCosh frequently sought the peace and inspiration provided by travel to rural areas in Illinois and Iowa, including occasionally with Grant Wood, the titan of regionalism who painted American Gothic in 1930 and shared McCosh's hometown. Throughout McCosh's life, and especially during the long period in which he was on the faculty of this university, travel was integral to a personal evolution. He always drew, always painted as he made his way. To travel meant to awaken one's spirit, personally, emotionally, professionally, artistically, and you don't need to be an artist for this effect to occur. Any of us have been to a place that made a difference in our lives and enhanced our understanding of ourselves, and this was certainly true for David McCosh. His first international experience was an 8-month-long trip to Europe funded by a prestigious fellowship from the Art Institute of Chicago. Traveling in England, Ireland, France, Switzerland, and Italy, McCosh did as any serious-minded student of painting would do, a popular practice even to this day. He stayed in Paris and visited the Louvre, every Sunday in fact, since it was the free day for the museum, and admired in particular the work of the masters. He wrote to friends many letters describing this experience, saying, "It was quite a sensation to walk down the Grand Gallery past Velázquez, Van Dyck's, Rubens, etc. by the dozen. Of the impressions that the work of the Grand Masters had made on him so far," he said, quote, "Manet's Olympia is one of the best nudes I've ever seen. You'd be surprised how big it is. Also, Whistler's Mother. But the best nude is by Rembrandt. It's the last word in nudes." And I always like to mention at this part, too, that Whistler's Mother is not a nude painting, but McCosh had written of being as impressed with it in the same breath as many other artists' work. Writing that they have a bunch of portraits by Rembrandt, McCosh described it as much more colorful and looser in technique than he expected, and that the Luxembourg galleries were surprisingly small and had a lot of junk, but some good stuff, too. Here's a drawing that he did of the Luxembourg Palace, July 16th, 1928. We were fortunate that the sketchbooks he kept from this trip, in most part, many of the images were dated precisely to the day, so it's easy to travel through, to retrace the steps that McCosh would have taken as a student traveling through Europe making these sketches. Writing to a friend, Meade Schaefer, from Paris, shortly after his 25th birthday in July 1928, the time when these drawings currently on view were made, McCosh spoke enthusiastically about what he had seen and done in France thus far, calling Montmartre and the area around Sacré-Cœur the artistic battleground of Paris. Though he lamented that he had not yet done much painting, but at least had a lot of sketches in pencil and ink to show for his time. Along with the cathedral at Chartres and the Château de Fontainebleau, he remarked on the juxtaposition of the old and the new at these sites, and how interesting he found that. Following Paris, he and his friend, Francis Chapin, with whom he was traveling, they left for Roscoff, a small fishing town in Brittany, and produced many works of the sailboats and the fishermen along the shore. From France, he traveled on to Switzerland and Italy. He wrote to his friend and the curator of art for the Cedar Rapids Public Library, Miss Bertha Sargent, from his hotel in Florence on November 3rd, saying, quote, "I have done only one watercolor and was rained on while laboring. I had a very interesting subject, one of the old city gates. Several of these still stand as part of the old city wall. The size of the structure is amazing. I had no conception to compare with the real thing." In Florence, they have only a few bridges. The latest one built was put up in the 16th century. They are very interesting, these old bridges. And the work on view right now that's on view in the McKinnon Gallery, City Gate, I believe to be that painting he was describing in this letter, especially seeing it in person. It's very clear that the watercolor running off the page could easily have been the result of not just a very wet brush, but also rain falling on the artist. It's a beautiful visual to imagine from the 1920s. From France and Switzerland and Italy, McCosh then gathered many sketches to be used for paintings. Some started while on his trip, and then also much material to be used when he returned to the studio back home in Chicago. In his same letter to Bertha Sargent, McCosh had written about the experience traveling from Lucerne, Switzerland. He wrote that our trip here was worth several picture galleries. Lucerne itself is a picture almost too perfect for even a picture. It is like a green nest in the mountains. Mountains tower up on all sides to show caps and are reflected in the famous Lake Lucerne. I never felt such sunshine or breathed such air. From Lucerne to Milan, the train wound through the Alps, giving us one view to Gaspet after another. One place the train passed the same church and village 3 times and climbing up out of the valley. At times, heavy mists would hang in the valleys, hiding the foot and leaving the peaks free. The effect is like Chinese prints of mountains, very mysterious and awesome. Early in the 1930s, McCosh was supporting himself by taking teaching jobs, occasional studio assistant positions, and then also doing his best to exhibit and sell his own work, including this painting, Women Ironing, from 1931, which is now in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. In 1934, he was offered a position at the University of Oregon to teach painting and lithography. It was his first time this far out west, and he had just recently been married to Anne Kutka, herself a very accomplished artist, and the couple made the journey out west for what they thought might be short-term teaching position in Eugene, and ended up being where they would spend the rest of their lives. It was in the 1930s, almost immediately upon arriving in Eugene, that McCosh began to mine the local area for inspiration. He was very taken with the area of the mill race near campus and the surrounding Hendricks Park, in the area near where he lived, and many of the works that he produced at this time were made in these local locations that he found to be incredibly inspiring. As his former student, Craig Cheshire, has described, in the early 1940s, McCosh received government commissions for murals in Washington, D.C. and South Dakota, and he exhibited widely, but the Second World War increasingly limited his activity. His commissions started to dry up, and though he still had his teaching position, so he had a regular paycheck, certainly he and other artists in the United States were feeling the strain of what was happening with their livelihoods during this difficult time for the country. When it became difficult to obtain painting materials, especially canvas and good paper, McCosh painted on whatever was available: cardboard, scraps of canvas, even old window shades, and certainly on the backs of other finished works. Travel by any means became nearly impossible, so much of his paintings during this period continued to be of Eugene subjects, many examples of which you'll see in the Schnitzer Gallery exhibition right now. As a result, by the end of the 1940s, McCosh was anxious to invigorate his own style of painting. He would later write in response to a reporter's question about amateur and professional painters that an amateurish characteristic, it seems to me, is to substitute a generalization for a specific instance. During this period, he was able to make some trips to Victoria, British Columbia, where he was especially interested. Oh, here's an image of the McCosh home on Fairmont Boulevard near campus. 2 images, where his home studio was then built. And more images of the local area in the 1940s. But getting back to talking about where else he had traveled here, he was able to travel to Victoria, British Columbia, where he was very interested in the boats in the harbor and the neo-Baroque Renaissance revival buildings of Parliament that had served as the water's backdrop. He taught, here's another image from Victoria. Just going back for a moment, he also was able to teach classes in Saugatuck, Michigan, where the Art Institute of Chicago had summer courses, and in Montana. So he was having an opportunity to get out of the Eugene area, but certainly he longed for something that would provide an even more inspirational effect on the work that he was creating. Motivated by this desire and his very strong urge that he needed a greater break from his everyday circumstances and surroundings, McCosh requested approval for a year-long sabbatical to commence the next academic year. As his place of study, he selected Cohasset Beach in Washington and in Mexico. And this would prove to be one of the most important milestones in his career that affected not just his own painting style, but also his teaching methods. And I should note, too, that there are occasionally different spellings of the term Cohasset. So on some of the images that will follow, you might see a double T in that word due to the way other artists have spelled the name of the location. On the peninsula separating Grays Harbor from the Pacific Ocean, there is on the ocean side an 18-mile-long beach, rather uninterrupted and pristine, in a region known as the Cranberry Coast. In this area, cranberries are grown, oysters are farmed, a winery has been located there, and the Grays Harbor, which is a bay that stretches approximately 20 miles down towards Aberdeen, Washington, is a flyway for migratory birds. There are natural preserves of trees and wetlands that provide habitats for many small wild animals, and storm watching in the winter is particularly popular among visitors. McCosh's late colleague from the art department, Lance Hart, had made regular, here's a contemporary view of the location. Lance Hart had made regular painting trips to this beach over 15 years earlier before McCosh's trip. The abstract expressionist Robert Motherwell was born in Aberdeen in 1915, but raised primarily in California, and he spent most summers in his grandfather's cabin on the beach at Westport. Motherwell had described the area as, quote, everything was Scandinavian there on account of all the lumberjacks. Everything was built in Scandinavian wooded style. Lance Hart was the first artist I had ever met and one of the loveliest men I ever met. Cohasset was a kind of real beautiful holiday from the world. And just also for reference, earlier images of the location around Grays Harbor and Westport. It was through the Lance Hart and Robert Motherwell family friendship that the younger artist was invited to come teach at the U for 1 year later on, but that's a story for another lecture. But just to get a sense of what kind of environment, both natural and social, it provided for artists, I thought it was important to mention these connections. Here are some images by Lance Hart to see what he created just about 19 years before McCosh would make his own trip there. And these are both in the collection of the George Schnitzer Museum of Art. So for comparison, this is the work that McCosh created when he arrived at the beach. This beach, this area, this natural landscape was exactly what he needed. Here he became experimental in subject and in process. He examined beach shrubbery, sand, driftwood, and even used sticks in place of a paintbrush at times so that he was having a very direct experience translating what his eyes were seeing into something in paint on a piece of paper. McCosh later told the head of the UO Art Department that, quote, the period at the beach provided a setting where conditions were stimulating to creative work, an abundance of new material for observation and relief from distracting interruptions. These 3.5 months I look back upon as the most profitable of the year, and indeed of many years. The significance of the research undertaken and the attitudes developed are more evident to me now than they were at the time," end quote. During his travels, McCosh visited several other schools in hopes of getting a fairly adequate idea of the methods and the objectives of art departments at other institutions. So upon leaving Cohasset Beach to head south to Mexico, he stopped and observed classes in progress at San Jose, California, and at Highlands University in Las Vegas. Here's a last beach image to give an example of the work that he had been doing while in Cohasset. And this is the mindset and sort of the painting process that he had developed at the time when he would head to Mexico for the rest of his year's sabbatical. The first 5 weeks in Mexico were spent in Mexico City and the surrounding area. He and wife Anne saw a rich deposit of historical monuments, and he noted the vigorous modern Renaissance that made its presence and vitality so evident there. Trips were made to sites of Diego Rivera murals and other sites important to artists, and the remaining 5 months were spent based in San Miguel de Allende, where the couple rented a house because McCosh wanted desperately to have a quiet place to work. For the first few months while there, he enrolled at the Institute of Fine Arts and took several classes which allowed him to be an anonymous participant in the same kinds of courses that he would have been teaching back home. The benefits of the sometimes rigorous experience of being a student instead of a teacher after so many years, he believed helped him develop a more sympathetic understanding of the student point of view, so that he could pass along that positive experience within his own classes upon return to the university. He also took a daily Spanish class while he was there for the first part of his education. The Mexican government had declared San Miguel a National Historic Monument in 1926. Development in the historic district had been restricted in order to preserve the town's colonial character. This act was pivotal to the growth of a beautiful city that still exists today in this state. After World War II, San Miguel began to revive as a tourist attraction as many demobilized United States GIs discovered that their education grants would allow them to pursue study in Mexico at U.S. accredited art schools. Particularly popular was the privately owned Instituto Allende, which had been founded in 1950, and the School of Bellas Artes, or Fine Arts, which was a nationally chartered school. American ex-servicemen had first arrived in 1946 to study, and by the end of 1947, the practice was so popular that Life magazine had assigned a reporter and photographer to do an article on this post-war phenomenon. There was a three-page spread that appeared in the January 5th, 1948 edition of the magazine under the headline, GI Paradise, Veterans Go to Mexico to Study Art, Live Cheaply, and Have a Good Time. So as a result of this publicity, thousands of American veterans had applied to study at the school. Not all could be accepted because at the time San Miguel only had a population fewer than 10,000 people. So this impact of so many tourists and students staying for a long period of time made a big change to the economy and to the local culture. So this is what the city looks like today. And so this is the experience that McCosh had, having left the rustic, quiet beach and going to a city that has such a vibrant arts community, so many Americans currently interested in traveling there, and all the opportunities that provided for stimulation, very unlike what he was viewing and painting from while living in Eugene. McCosh would later say that as time went on during this trip and then upon his return to Eugene, the ideas and directions generated at the beach in Washington were enlarged, developed, and reapplied, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. The results formed something like an expanded notebook of first-hand experiences recorded without much reworking. He felt that the quality he wanted could only come from an abundant quantity of work. He took many photographs of not just documenting he and Anne's travels and the people they met and the places they visited, but also of interesting material that, as he had described, would sort of add to that visual notebook to be reworked later in painting. So examples of his sketches of cactus drawn in charcoal on paper, and the way that this visual material was then turned into finished paintings really illustrate the different ways he was approaching his material and how far he was already coming from the Midwest regionalism that had marked his early time in Chicago. And I should mention, too, that the couple had stopped in New Mexico at the San Juan Pueblo in July 1950 at the conclusion of their trip. McCosh would later say to a student that he, quote, "I could have looked for scenes and qualities in Mexico that were like Oregon. However, I chose to select materials that, to my mind, were like Mexico," end quote. And you can see that even by 1951, too, this impact of having been at the beach at Cohasset would continue to play into the work that McCosh would create when making trips to the Oregon coast, looking for that same sort of wild, natural stimulus. He had an exhibition in May 1951 of work completed on this trip. It contained 47 watercolors and 18 oil paintings. In total, he had done twice that amount during his travel, and some of the watercolors were then shown at the Karuba Gallery in Portland. A majority were shown at the Seattle Art Museum in a solo show, and then Cactus, the work we just took a look at here, was even included in the national exhibition American Painting Today 1950, held at the Met from December 9th, 1950 to February 25th, 1951. Upon the return from Mexico, McCosh applied what he had learned through such travels to the scenes he painted of his beloved and deeply familiar Eugene surroundings. And I believe that having achieved fresh inspiration elsewhere made it possible for him to see his own neighborhood anew upon his return. In 1955, the McCoshes purchased a 2-story cabin with a stone chimney surrounded by Douglas firs and quite a bit of land on Horse Creek near Mackenzie Bridge east of Springfield in Eugene. Here, about an hour's drive away from his home and workplace, McCosh was able to access some of the sensations that had come so readily when he traveled to the Washington coast and to Mexico in the previous years. He used the cabin for painting and for fishing trips until the early 1970s, and throughout that time, he would make many stays there and produce work that really allowed him to sort of access a very genuine experience as an artist. Almost 10 years after the first sabbatical, here's additional images of what the landscape around Horse Creek looked like and the cabin right along the water. Go back to that for a moment. So as I started to mention, excuse me, he planned to return to Europe 30 years after his original student trip. And on this trip, McCosh would be able to see the Brussels World Fair. He had participated as a mural artist in the Chicago's World Fair in 1933, so he had had an experience of being in the midst of such a great environment, bringing together so many thinkers and creative types and people from all over the world. These are not images that McCosh took on his trip, but to give a sense of the environment that he and Anne would have been in when visiting Brussels at this time. From there, they traveled to the Netherlands, spending 2 weeks in Amsterdam and other cities, and then traveled through Germany en route to Switzerland. In some of the places they visited, it wasn't conducive for creating artwork, and so he and Anne took advantage of visiting museums and churches and just having the experience of enjoying being outside of their usual circumstances. Certainly, though, he was looking forward to being in a place where he could achieve that sense of quiet that he had sought when he was in San Miguel and have some real time devoted to painting and responding to everything that they had seen on their trip. McCosh would later say in a letter, quote, "I don't think we missed a museum and have run up quite a score on churches, too. 4 days in Venice were too fun, as was the week in Florence. A week in Assisi was a high spot, literally, oh-ho. For the first time, I tried some watercolors and found myself even rustier than I expected. We had planned to go to Sicily, but at Pompeii decided to find a place to settle down for some more work and more sightseeing before the weather changed. A week ago, we found an apartment in Vence, and we are very happy to be here. Our place is on the ramparts, and from our window we get a magnificent view, including the Matisse Chapel at eye level across the valley." So at this point, as McCosh is writing, he's reflecting on the time that he had spent in Assisi, where he painted watercolors like the work you see here. But then from there, he and Anne had traveled to Vence, France, and were able to, again, rent a studio where they could produce works such as the one that you see here. McCosh had remarked that living in France was expensive, just as everyone had warned him it would be, but it was a comfort to find art materials, for the most part, even cheaper than he would have in Eugene. Vence is only 13 miles to Nice, and he and Anne would often go into the larger city to get more paper and paint. McCosh wrote that the olive trees in this area were going to break him. He found them absolutely beautiful, and many of the images that he created in the Vence area are focused on the native olive trees. After this trip, they headed to Spain. Having spent time in Spain, then for the final leg of their sabbatical, the McCoshes traveled to Cornwall, England, where again McCosh was able to spend some time getting out into the landscape and was particularly taken with the local flora and the atmosphere of the beautiful English countryside. He would later say that perhaps the most valuable experience of the trip, in addition to having this time to paint, was getting that opportunity to see the original many paintings he had previously known only from reproductions. This would be a memorable experience for anyone, but he thought it was particularly invaluable for teachers who use such material reference in their instruction almost daily. He wrote that the subtle distortions that reproductions produce can contribute to much misunderstanding and misdirection, something he found particularly dangerous due to an abundance of reproductions and the widespread reliance on them in teaching. Having been to Europe 30 years earlier, and at that time having visited many of the large museums, the experience of returning to see works he had missed on the first trip, and then also works that he was seeing for the first time, or for the second time after 3 decades, it was a shock to discover for him how his memory had weakened or falsified the total effect of those paintings. So certainly that experience of getting to return to the museums and spend time with original works of art was incredibly important and made a profound effect on McCosh, as well as reinforcing his thoughts about the value of spending time with the original object. Writing again about Assisi, he wrote that those days were of extra value since he was able to attempt some work on his own paintings, and that the work was serving as a means of settling his thoughts and impressions. He had written that Italy had seemed a favorable place to settle for an extended stay, but was too full of grand monuments. In the end, he really thought Vence came close to being the perfect spot for contemplation and study, and they had stayed there for a month and would have remained longer if the weather had been more promising. I'm going to go back to the image from Vence for a moment. From Vence south, their trip through the various other parts of France was also remarkable because, as McCosh had said, equal to the thrill of seeing the originals of well-known paintings was the experience of seeing the actual landscapes that painters he admired like Cézanne and Bonnard and Van Gogh had used for their material. He felt that the power of good painting to reform nature and its image is inescapable, and he had said that Cézanne had made the country around his own, and that he at least can see it in no other way now. And then returning to some of the works he had created in Spain. Because they had spent 6 months in Spain, it gave McCosh the chance to concentrate uninterruptedly on his own efforts in painting, and he worked almost continuously because he had the opportunity that he could really develop a clear direction in his work. He did not want to rework previous ideas, but rather was attempting to draw from this foreign situation some material that would be fresh for him. Again, though the weather had curtailed his trip, and so he had to make accommodations and do some of his work indoors and move along to more hospitable locations. He said that there is a body of material and study form that he hopes to find time to explore in his studio at home. He found it necessary to try many ideas, to make many starts before he could come to a connection about the best use of this new material. The work from Spain may not come out in form very much, but its influence will affect my painting, he wrote, and ideas for some time will be affected by this trip. So returning to talking about Cornwall. The last week in England was spent with a painter friend who had invited the couple to stay in his studio in Hampstead. While there, McCosh met and talked extensively with several painters and teachers. This social aspect of his trip was also very valuable and was in many ways an illuminating experience. Going on these sabbaticals also, McCosh felt very strong about the fact that this would make him a better teacher, being able to share his experience, but also being able to sort of liven up the work that he was doing and reinvigorate his commitment to painting and to providing his students a really wonderful educational experience focused on painting and painting honestly and authentically. He continued to make trips to his cabin at Horse Creek, where he focused on the surrounding landscape, but then also became increasingly abstract in his work because he had moved to a point in his painting so far removed from the strict regional representational style that now he was so direct in his observation that The works become this amazing experience of form and color that really represents that moment that he would have spent, in this case in the lava beds east of Eugene and Springfield. He continued to paint in his surrounding areas, so many of the works on view in the exhibition include images of the neighboring homes on Fairmont Boulevard, and another work from near their second home at Horse Creek. David McCosh's final sabbatical as an instructor was to New Mexico and returning to San Miguel de Allende, as well as visiting Mexico City and the Yucatan. He had initially planned to spend 6 weeks in New Mexico at a small ranch outside of Santa Cruz, and then 6 months in Mexico and the remaining time in Japan. This would have been his first time visiting Asia, so it's very interesting to imagine what effect that might have had on his work had he been able to make that portion of the trip. Unfortunately, gallbladder surgery had been necessary early on in the sabbatical year and altered he and Ann's plans. During his recuperation, McCosh lived in an adobe house on the San Juan Indian Reservation in New Mexico. He had stopped in Tucson on the way from New Mexico to Mexico and then made a stop to see murals by Jose Clemente Orozco in a nearby city. Arriving in San Miguel de Allende on January 4th, 1966, McCosh found the city to still contain the greatest concentration of stimulating material for his work, and he made it his home base for trips by both car and bus to other sites outside of the city. He wrote that the most unusual excursion he took was a trip to San Juan de los Lagos, where he arrived the day after vast crowds of pilgrims had been there for an annual event at a local shrine. Thousands of pilgrims walk incredible distances to converge at the sanctuary on this one day. They camp en route and take over the countryside. McCosh wrote that the group we were part of comprised only foreigners. We felt we were witnessing something from the Middle Ages. His most ambitious trip was to the Yucatan to see archaeological sites. He and Ann drove past many ruins en route, and the landscape was of continued interest. They rented a cottage, visited museums, and spent time making sketches for new material. McCosh remained ever committed to the idea of bringing back fresh inspiration for his new work. These are examples of the works that he produced on this second sabbatical to Mexico. In total, the trip resulted in 10 canvases and about 30 watercolors, as well as experiments in other media. This was the last sabbatical McCosh would take, as he retired from teaching in 1971 and spent much of the last 10 years of his life painting when his health allowed in his own home studio. And here are some examples of later works that he created before he sold the cabin. Let's go back to that to end on. In the previously mentioned letter to a former student, McCosh had said that, quote, "Critics look at things, paintings included, in order to evaluate them. Painters look at paintings and nature in order to find what they can use," end quote. He gave the encouragement that one ought to attempt a drawing of something very similar to them, being aware that nothing put down should not have you should put nothing down that was not directly derived from the exact subject that one is studying. McCosh's work is solid in terms of both conception and technique, but truly remarkable in its ability to capture the unique effects and fleeting sensations of those places that caught his interest, whether he sought them out in distant locations or they revealed themselves to him closer to home. If you are interested in more information about artists who are part of the School of Architecture and Allied Arts Department in the last 100 years, I invite you to attend a lecture given by Professor Emeritus Ken O'Connell on Wednesday, January 21st at 5:30 at the JSMA Ford Lecture Hall on 100 Years of Artists in AAA. Thank you very much.